There's a little documentary on it. You know who Oliver Stone is? He and Vladimir Putin did a documentary on why Russia invaded the Ukraine, the Crimea in Ukraine. To build up, there was a lot of stuff in that documentary in the building up of that thing. When Nazi Germany invaded the Ukraine, they created a bunch of Ukrainian forces, where those forces were the ones who rounded up Jews, communists, dissidents, the unhealthy, the anti-German, and put them in concentration and turn them into ash. There was a bunch of little Ukrainian troops like that. Oh yeah, that's basically the same thing of Germany walking into France, knowing that a certain percentage of the French police will work for the Germans. A certain percentage of the population will work for the Germans. When Germany invaded France, the main language was German. French was the secondary language. When Russia invaded Poland, the main language happened to be Russian. In Ukraine, the main language happened to be Russian. What did Stalin do when he invaded Ukraine? He picked up all the Nazi groups, executed them. At the end of the war, he picked up all the guerrilla groups that were fighting the Nazis and executed them. Because one hand they're fighting the Nazis, the next day they could be fighting the Russians. So the Russian basically. The main language in Ukraine since 60 years under the Soviet bloc was Russian. In Poland it was Russian. East Germany was Russian. Hungary it was Russian. Yugoslavia was Yugoslavia. But the secondary language was Russian. And that was the same thing. When I went to Cambodia, the main language was Cambodian, and when I went to Vietnam, that was Vietnamese was the thing. Even though you had 500,000 English Americans running around that country, the main language still was Vietnamese, because you only stood there. You only went there one tour, and most didn't speak Vietnamese. But in Ukraine, it was Russian and then Ukraine. Ukrainians learned two languages. They learned Ukraine and they learned Russian. And if you wanted to do anything Ukraine, you had to do it in Russian. What does that mean? That means if you want to go to Quebec, Canada, speak French, because they don't speak, or they will not speak English if they can avoid you. Quebec City, Montreal, they speak in multi-languages. On the countryside, they speak French. They do not like English. They don't like the Tories. They don't like the British. So you learn that. As I said, in Ukraine, there was two languages spoken. The main language was Russian. If you're going to deal with all stores and that had to learn Russian. Ukraine was considered being the other language. Ukraine language by the Russians they considered all Ukrainians Nazis. Period. But all the Nazis were killed. Doesn't make any difference. They considered all Ukrainians Nazis. When the Ukrainians decided to rebel against the pro-Russian government, they were all labeled far-right neo-Nazis and were dealt that way. And up to the time the Soviet Union broke up, Ukrainians considered the Nazis. So Oliver Stone and Vladimir Putin, when they did their film about the Crimea, 10,000 Russian troops invaded Crimea, two things happened. Those who spoke Russian weren't killed, and those who only spoke Ukrainian were killed. They were driven out. So when the Russians decided to have an election to elect somebody, it was all in Russian. Of course, the Russian elections are that thing. It's all secret ballot. You check in all those little boxes and who you wanted to put in. And to make sure you checked in all those little boxes, there would be a commissar. You would hand your ballot to the guy sitting there to make sure you checked in all the boxes, and then he would hand it back to you. If you didn't check in the right boxes, he said that this box isn't checked in correctly. And so he would have an eraser or white out, and he said, "Are you sure you want to do that?" "Oh, I made a mistake." "Oh, no, I didn't want that guy in there. I wanted the pro-Russian guy in there." So having 98% of the Russians vote the right way was very simple, because they all checked the right boxes. Or was it the left boxes? I have to watch my language there in a foreign country like that, because either you were pro-Russian or you were the guy who gets pulled out of there and shot. It's like, yeah, that's Russian. So there are no Ukrainians in Crimea. Well, yeah. And in Russian-occupied territory, any of the Ukrainians that they find, they shoot as being Nazis. That's, yeah. So you have to understand Oliver Stone's Ukraine on Fire. They compared that with, well, it's all pro-Russian, but they compared it with, what was the one, Hitler's Triumph of Will. That Oliver Stone was that type of producer, filmmaker, on the like Triumph of Will. Are you saying that Oliver Stone in that time, he would have been a producer for Triumph of Will? That's the type. I got to remember, Oliver Stone has interviews with Fidel Castro and the president of Venezuela and other despots of the world. And how to justify that is any kind of uprising in Ukraine was backed by the United States. You got to understand about in the United States, there's a lot of Ukrainian nationals in the United States. In Chicago, you have the Ukrainian village. In New York, you have the Ukrainian village. In Dallas, you have the Ukrainian village. As you have the Korean village, or you have the Japanese village, that thing. There are stores in around Chicago that only cater to certain ethnic groups. You have the Polish store that basically is everything in the store is Polish, or the Ukrainian, or the Japanese stuff, or the Korean stores, or the Middle Eastern stores, or the Indian stores. Yeah. So you have those cater to that thing. While the main English is English, the secondary languages are all the other ethnic groups. In India, which is a very prime example, you have English, you got one of the main Indian languages, and then you have the 300 dialects there. And if you happen to have a store and you're Indian owner, you have to carry a lot of stuff in your store. But as I said, Ukraine on Fire is a documentary produced by Oliver Stone and Vladimir Putin. And it's everything within that documentary is slated for Russia. It had to be approved by Vladimir Putin. And all the Ukrainians are Nazis, which would justify 2022, when Russian forces invaded Ukraine to kill all the Nazis. Well, and of course, they ran into the factors. Ukraine's older generation in Ukraine can speak Russian. But now all Ukrainians are considered to be Nazis. So you convince your troops, the Russian troops, convince that they're all Nazis. And if you look at the critics of Ukraine on Fire, they basically say it's all pro-Russian. It's all pro-Kremlin. It's anti-Ukraine. So